Sanctioning bodies play a critical role in just about every form of motorsport, from the lowest tiers of karting to the highest level of international open-wheel racing. These organizations don't just set and enforce rules. They're also key meaning makers who decide what the sport is actually going to be. In post-World War II America, there were a few different sanctioning bodies that regulated motorsport, but a fierce battle began to wage between two of those bodies, the AAA and the SCCA. Both organizations represented totally different views about what American motorsport should be, and both were prepared to fight to make their way of thinking the primary one dictating motorsport in the United States. Today on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we're delving into a tense fight between the isolationists and the internationalists, between the SCCA and the AAA. It's a fight that very nearly killed the growth of American motorsport, and its end only came as the result of international tragedy. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. One of the first formal motorsport sanctioning bodies in the United States was the AAA Contest Board, the motorsport arm of the American Automobile Association. The AAA itself was founded back in 1902 with the hope of lobbying politicians to build roads that were more suitable for the automobile. It published road maps, launched driver safety programs, and advocated for pedestrian safety. That organization still exists today, though you probably know it better for its AAA Roadside Assistance Program, where you can pay a regular fee to have the ability to call for help anytime you have an emergency on the road. A big part of the AAA's original mission was sanctioning motorsport. The racing arm of the AAA, called the Contest Board, was also developed in 1902, just a few months after the AAA overall was born, as a way to sanction the Vanderbilt Cup, one of the first major automobile races in the United States. But the AAA's Contest Board was almost immediately born into controversy. William K. Vanderbilt, a member of the prominent Vanderbilt family that built its fortune on shipping and railroad empires, chose the Contest Board to sanction the race he dreamed up on Long Island. See, before the AAA Contest Board, there was actually another motorsport sanctioning body in the United States called the Automobile Club of America, or ACA. This sanctioning body was founded in 1899 by a group of gentlemen racers and was designed to, quote, maintain a social club devoted to the sport of automobilism and to its development throughout the country. This organization even went so far as to help the AAA get off the ground in 1902, only for the two organizations to start feuding shortly afterward. In 1908, the AAA and the ACA faced their first significant ideological difference. Events like the Vanderbilt Cup began to draw in exceptional European talent, and American manufacturers that were slower to develop were soon overrun at the Indianapolis 500 as well. That was also in part due to the formation of yet another sanctioning body, the MCA, or the Manufacturers Contest Association. This group of automakers actually lobbied the AAA to create more favorable racing rules for American automakers, but that resulted in cars that just couldn't compete with the best that Europe had to offer. So the AAA and the ACA soon fractured, with the AAA handling national races and the ACA handling international events that took place on American soil. Just before its demise during the Great Depression, though, the ACA quietly rejoined the AAA in a last-ditch effort to keep itself afloat. It ultimately was dissolved in 1932. The following year, 1933, saw the introduction of another motorsport sanctioning body called the Automobile Racing Club of America, or ARCA. As a side note, even though this ARCA shares the same name with the NASCAR-sanctioned stock car racing series that still races today, it is actually a totally different entity, and they're both completely separate with different histories. Our version of ARCA existed for a very brief period of time between the Great Depression and the start of World War II. It was founded by brothers Miles, Sam, and Baron Collier, whose father had made a fortune in the subway and streetcar advertising industry. When their eldest brother Barron's fiancée brought an MG J2 car to the family property in Westchester County, New York, everyone had their lives transformed. The MG Car Company was a British sports car manufacturer known for its light, powerful machines, totally different than anything being offered by American manufacturers at the time. Barron, Sam, and Miles Collier were entranced by this foreign technology and left for Europe in 1934 with the goal of seeking out even better machinery. The trip was a massive success. Not only did the brothers come home with plenty of other race cars, but they also signed on to become the first official MG importers in America. When they came home, they built a 3.3-mile road course in Briarcliff, New York, and raced in both Europe and America until the onset of World War II halted racing activities. All three brothers served with distinction in the war, though Barron died in 1939. This short-lived sanctioning body paved the way for the development of the Sports Car Club of America, or the SCCA, in 1944. The SCCA, though, was primarily an amateur organization for wealthy folks who owned sports cars. Many former ARCA competitors moved over to the SCCA, including the Collier brothers, but for several years, there was no racing to be done. It was kind of a gentleman's social club for rich guys who owned sports cars. To gain entry, you had to be formally endorsed by someone who was already part of the club. The entirety of the SCCA would then scrutinize your entry, mainly to decide if you owned a cool enough sports car, had enough money, and would get along with everyone else. Then, the SCCA members would vote on whether or not you gained entrance. Every so often, the members would engage in some informal rallying, but the first SCCA-sanctioned racing event on a road course did not take place until 1948, with the introduction of the Watkins Glen Grand Prix. I won't bog you down with details about the formation of the Watkins Glen race, because I've covered that in a previous episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. That episode was titled Death at Watkins Glen, How One Forgotten Crash Changed Motorsport Forever. So go listen to that, make sure you get your context. Most important for our purposes in this episode, though, is that the first official SCCA-sanctioned race was a huge success, and it paved the way for more events, both at Watkins Glen and at newly constructed street tracks all around the United States. However, because the SCCA remained an amateur organization, these races excluded professional drivers, and no driver was paid for competing in any way. They weren't even allowed to accept free lodging or compensated meals in exchange for their racing services. While all of this was going on, the AAA Contest Board had created the National Championship, which linked together several different races around America, though the crowning event of every season was the Indianapolis 500. Car specifications were developed with the 500 in mind, but the AAA had also grown to sanction sprint car racing, sports car racing, stock car racing, and so much more. It wasn't long before the two primary sports car sanctioning bodies in the United States, the SCCA and the AAA, began to butt heads. Friends, we are firmly in the throes of Indy 500 territory right now, and do you want to know how I know? My friends at Homefield Apparel, an incredible vintage-style clothing brand, are about to drop an amazing Indy 500 merch collection to help you start prepping for the best event of the year. I know my Indy fans are familiar with the Borg-Warner trophy and the little guy on top holding the checkered flag, but did you know that from the right angle, that little man's penis is actually fully exposed? If you didn't know, now you do. And you also have my permission to share that fun fact with anyone you meet anytime you wear Homefield's new t-shirt featuring the Borg-Warner checkered flag man, but it is from the angle where there is no PP. To get your fix, head to homefieldapparel.com or head to the link in the description of this episode. If you find something you love, do not forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. By 1950, it had become clear that not all was well between the two sports car sanctioning bodies in America. The success of the 1948 Watkins Glen Grand Prix had led to a massive spike in interest in this new sport, and events began to pop up in the Midwest, Florida, and California, the latter of which had its own unique set of sanctioning bodies specific to the state. However, there was one big event that really set off a chain reaction of conflicting events. The once amateur racers of the SCCA began to get a taste of the international racing scene. While these men couldn't be paid for their racing services in the United States, they could travel outside of the country for a taste of professional competition. Several SCCA racers took part in the Carrera Panamericana, a massive rally that spanned from one end of Mexico to the other. Other SCCA racers headed over to France to compete in the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the most iconic endurance race in the world. On one of those trips to France, two SCCA members approached the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, or the FIA. Those men, carmaker, yachtsman, and entrepreneur Briggs Cunningham, and eventual race promoter and Russian émigré Alec Ullman, negotiated with that sanctioning body and convinced it to oversee the 1950 running of the Watkins Glen Grand Prix. It would be the first sports car race in the United States sanctioned by the FIA and the third American event overall to receive that honor after the Indianapolis 500 and the Pikes Peak Hill Climb. The ramifications of that decision weren't immediately clear, but if you've been paying attention, you'll probably notice that the FIA sanctioning of an SCCA sports car race would easily break a lot of the established rules about how motorsport was supposed to operate in America. The Watkins Glen Grand Prix remained a prize-free event, which meant that European talent didn't bother to make the trip overseas, much to the frustration of Ullman, Cunningham, and Watkins Glen founder Cameron Argetsinger. Further, the AAA was annoyed that this little racing organization had gone directly to Europe's biggest sanctioning body without consulting it first. The AAA was, at the time, the liaison for the FIA, and they should probably have used the AAA to facilitate that conversation. But there was another issue that year too. Because the SCCA had opened up the Watkins Glen Grand Prix to FIA-sanctioned cars, it also felt it necessary to allow some other racing organizations in America, namely the MG Car Club and the Motorsport Club of America, to select 3 representatives to enter the race at the Glen. One of those representatives was Erwin Goldschmidt Jr. Goldschmidt was a member of the AAA and the MSCA, so his skill set was clearly there, but the SCCA hated this man. While Philippe Defechereaux writes in Watkins Glen the Street Years that the dislike actually came from Goldschmidt's alleged loud arrogance, Goldschmidt had a different read on the situation. He felt that there was prejudice against him because he was Jewish. The SCCA shot down allegations of bias, but many within the organization secretly hoped that Goldschmidt would perform poorly in the race because they didn't want him to win their iconic Grand Prix. Those hopes were all for naught because Goldschmidt won. It was a pivotal moment that further solidified 2 very different ideologies that had begun to develop in the SCCA. Some members, like Ullman, Cunningham, and Argetsinger, thought that American road racing should become a more professionalized sport, one that could be a key player on the international stage. The other camp, however, desperately wanted to retain its amateur status. Goldschmidt's victory brought those 2 mindsets into sharp relief. The isolationist members of the SCCA, the ones who wanted to remain amateur, were deeply annoyed that a non-member had won their marquee event of the year. The folks looking to transform the SCCA into a more international organization, though, took Goldschmidt's victory as a sign that they should keep trying to recruit a greater number of racers from all over the world. But something else happened at that race, something that continued to push those opposing mindsets into sharp relief. Spectators had been injured, and ARCA founder Sam Collier had been killed in a different crash. Over in Europe, where motorsport history was founded on public roads, death at the track was accepted as a common enough occurrence. For the SCCA, though, it was uniquely horrifying. The point of racing for them was to foster a gentlemanly kind of competition that should never result in legitimate harm to anyone, drivers, or spectators. Then, on December 31st, came yet another complicating factor. Alec Ullman had negotiated use of a decommissioned Air Force base in Sebring, Florida, to host a serious 6-hour endurance event. Ullman's hopes for that event were purely international. He wanted it, ultimately, to appeal to the best racers in the world. Ullman had attended the 24 Hours of Le Mans several times in the 1930s, and he had also helped Briggs Cunningham organize his team's trip to the iconic event in 1950. Ullman's day job, buying, reconditioning, and then selling surplus military aircraft, gave him plenty of contacts in the military world, and there was plenty of available racing space in the form of all of those air bases that had become less important at the end of World War II. Ullman had the space to develop an endurance race. He had the key personnel to create the rules for the race in the form of SCCA member and Glen founder Cameron Argetsinger, and the technical aspects were taken care of thanks to SCCA member Bill Milliken. But when Ullman approached the FIA with his master plan, he was shocked to learn the sanctioning body wouldn't work with him in the SCCA because its only valid American partner was the AAA. As negotiations continued, the French backed out of offering any official support. Ullman proceeded with the event nevertheless, modeling Sebring's regulatory set on those that would have been used by the FIA. He received help from the AAA as well as from the Royal Automobile Club over in England, but opted to strictly invite American talent for that first running. However, when Ullman approached the SCCA about his idea with the goal of perhaps uniting sanctioning bodies all around the world, he was shut down. As he later recalled, quote, "I was told that SCCA was not going to debase its image by joining that roughneck, bloodthirsty professional drivers organization, the AAA, that foreign drivers and foreign teams coming to America was a pipe dream." It's probably safe to say, then, that the SCCA was not going to change its firmly anti-professional stance, even if a dedicated slate of SCCA members developed and hosted that first successful Sebring event. They named it the Sam Collier Memorial Grand Prix of Endurance in honor of their fallen friend. The 1950 Sebring Endurance Race was a watershed moment in the battle between American sanctioning bodies. In the eyes of the SCCA, Alec Ullman had committed 3 major sins. First, he had worked with both the AAA as well as the RAC, outsourcing to professional organizations and to foreign ones. Second, Ullman had invited the best American racers to his event regardless of their sanctioning body affiliation. That included the SCCA's hated Erwin Goldschmidt. Finally, he'd created a collision of ideologies within the SCCA itself. Ullman was subsequently dropped from his role as a key player in the SCCA. A new SCCA Contest Board grew, with Ullman's technical advisor Bill Milliken as the new chairman. That new board decided to get rid of the FIA regulations that had inspired previous SCCA races and rewrote them with a more American manufacturer focus in mind. The hardline stance alienated other key SCCA members, like Watkins Glen founder Cameron Argetsinger and ARCA founder Miles Collier. It all proceeded to kick off a major battle between different factions, which was waged via letter as well as in the pages of Sports Car Magazine, the SCCA's official publication. Key players in the battle of words were Colonel Arthur A. Harrington of the AAA and D. Cameron Peck, the president of the SCCA. Peck and his retiring vice president, Colonel George Felton, both agreed that merely kicking out the rebellious members of the SCCA was not going to be enough. Instead, they needed to issue a formal censure of those men. Peck sent a letter to Colonel Harrington of the AAA to note that the SCCA was not attempting to deny the AAA's association with the FIA, but that it absolutely rejected the idea that the AAA could decide on any regulations that might impact the SCCA. 10 men who had formerly been of the SCCA had defected to follow their own internationalist bent, and those men decided to return fire in the war of words. They sent a 4-page memorandum to all of the then current SCCA members that proposed an overhaul of SCCA bylaws. These petitioners claimed that SCCA President Peck had officially given Alec Ullman permission to serve as the SCCA's liaison with the AAA, and that his removal from the organization was therefore wrong. It also alleged that the SCCA was breaking its own rules by failing to participate in racing events, that the club risked becoming an armchair organization overseeing insignificant events, and that the SCCA members who had been participating in international racing events proved that the SCCA's direction was misguided. Among the 10 men who signed that document were Arjit Singer, Ullman, Miles Collier, and North American Ferrari importer Luigi Chinetti. Colonel Harrington himself of the AAA also responded to Peck's letter, unaware that 10 former members of the SCCA had already been in contact with SCCA membership. Harrington wrote, "Frankly, I am unable to understand the assertion of an existing controversy between the SCCA and the AAA. I was not aware of the existence of such a strong controversy." Harrington went on to note that he was aware that American sports car representatives had gone to Paris to speak to the FIA, and that Harrington had set up a second meeting with French sporting authorities when he received a letter from Peck stating that Peck had refused to attend. Quote, "We did not feel that we were justified in calling off this conference because you took this rather arbitrary position without even considering the possibility of sitting down and listening to the conversation," Harrington wrote. This all stemmed from Ullman once again returning to Paris to speak to the FIA, hoping to convince them that his Sebring event should be a 12-hour race that goes on the FIA official calendar. In his letter, Harrington pointed out that the growth of road racing was still very new, so it would take time to determine if it had legs as a form of professional sport, but that he saw no point in developing an entire rule set specific to amateur American racing, not when someone out there had developed international racing rules that worked well in Europe and South America. Then Harrington finished off with a serious punch, and I'm going to quote these final paragraphs in total as they're written in Philippe Defechereaux' book Watkins, Glen, the Street Years. No summary I will ever come up with will be as good as the real thing. Harrington wrote, "Our methods are not those of a dictator who would attempt to propound our rules and foist them upon you. The whole tone of your communication would seem to imply the meaning that you are an organization controlling all sports car activities in the United States. We deeply regret that you do not see your way clear to accord your colleagues in the sports car or amateur racing activity the courtesy of sitting down with them and with us to consider this whole proposed course of action in a temperate and businesslike manner. Had you had the opportunity of attending one of our meetings, as your colleagues have done, I am quite sure that you would have occasion to considerably revise the opinions and assertions set forth to the members of your Sports Car Club of America. We propose to continue our conversation with your colleagues. If, as a result of these talks, it should be determined that it is advisable for us to assume control of amateur automobile racing in the United States, it will be our intention to do so." As you can imagine, those words were the motorsport equivalent of declaring war. SCCA President Peck had certainly taken a hefty blow with Harrington's letter, but he was ready to return fire with a letter of his own. Again, allow me to quote directly from the letter as reported in Defechereaux' book. "I appreciate your frankness and the complete expression of your opinion. I realize that a controversy, if such it must be called, does not exist between SCCA and AAA as such, but rather between the majority of SCCA's members and a small minority within our club who are using AAA's name and prestige. We appreciate your assurance that AAA does not seek to take control of amateur automobile racing. No representative of SCCA was ever instructed to bypass AAA and to obtain direct recognition from the FIA. That one SCCA official did so on his own initiative is correct. We have found the International Rulebook a reasonably satisfactory framework within which to operate, but have never hesitated to make whatever changes would bring about the fairest and most sporting competition among our members. We are glad to have you state that your methods are not those of a dictator. Neither are ours. However, we view with some amusement your assertion that if, as a result of these talks, it should be determined that it is advisable for us to assume control of amateur automobile racing in the United States, it will be our intention to do so. Talks with groups representing a small minority of the organized enthusiasts in this country hardly justify taking control of anything. The day after he received that letter from Peck, Colonel Harrington responded. He stated that he felt there had been some misunderstanding between the two men, then added that the AAA wouldn't attempt to seek control of amateur sports car racing in America, at least unless a majority of sports car clubs of the United States members were to ask the AAA to take control. That pluralization of sports car clubs is key. Harrington seemed to imply that the AAA could absorb control of, say, California's racing clubs or the Motorsport Club of America, to which Erwin Goldschmidt belonged. Should the AAA do that, it could exert much more pressure on the SCCA. SCCA President Peck published Harrington's letter in the March and April issue of Sports Car magazine, refuting every paragraph one by one. That particular battle fizzled out for a time, but the overall war between the internationalists and the isolationists raged on. The next fight came during planning for the 1951 Watkins Glen Grand Prix. Cameron Argetsinger stood before the race's organizing board to propose that running the event under FIA sanction would not merely open it to more impressive international talent, but that the events would be conducted with a greater safety measure than the SCCA could provide. The vote there was equally split, but at a second meeting, early Grand Prix founder Bill Milliken made a compelling case for the event staying its course. After all, the previous 3 runnings of the race had grown each year under the current isolationist formula. Why make a drastic change when you weren't fully confident you could guarantee success? Argetsinger and Milliken met up just after that fateful meeting. Argetsinger mentioned that he was bitterly disappointed, but he didn't intend to leave the SCCA. Milliken, meanwhile, refused to budge from the SCCA party line. Before the 1951 Watkins Glen Grand Prix, Argetsinger was involved in a road accident with his friend, racer Sam Cobain. Cobain attempted to pass a slower car at regular road speeds when he lost control and was killed by a cone-shaped horn button that pierced his chest at just the wrong angle. Argetsinger was thrown from the car and suffered a concussion. His doctor advised him against racing in the near future, including in that autumn's Watkins Glen Grand Prix. His name was nixed almost entirely from the official race program. As the 1951 season came to an end, SCCA President Cameron Peck wrote of the battle between the SCCA and the AAA in very succinct terms. Again, I'm pulling these paragraphs from Defechereaux' Watkins Glen: The Street Years. Every aspect of professionalism must be avoided, including such borderline matters as payment of expenses for appearances. Either we keep this game an amateur one, or we will see it fall into decay and disrepute. Our standards of amateurism should be reduced to writing and published for the distribution of all future members. The affairs of the AAA and the SCCA impinge, of necessity, at only one point, namely where international competition enters the picture or where SCCA members wish to secure FIA permits to race abroad. To this end, a meeting will be held in the near future between 3 members of the AAA Contest Board and 3 members of the SCCA. With that note, Peck resigned from his position as SCCA president. A nomination would take place in 1952 to appoint a new one, but in the meantime, Peck's position was taken over by his vice president, Fred Wacker. Even though the SCCA seemed to have won the war against the internationalists, their territory was a surprisingly narrow one. 9 of the 12 biggest sports car races in the world took place in America in 1951, while European machinery had become commonplace in the U.S. racing scene. It was enough to inspire Alec Ullman to continue raging his international battle well into 1952. Back in 1951, Ullman had again gone to Le Mans, where he served as team manager for Briggs Cunningham, but again, his goal was much greater. Ullman also intended to secure official FIA sanction for his next Sebring event, while also enticing European teams to come over to compete. He secured a date of March 12, 1952 for the FIA-sanctioned race. But when Peck resigned from the SCCA at the end of 1951, Ullman attempted to rush into the power vacuum he left behind. Ullman and Argetsinger placed their support behind Miles Collier to take over as president, while Ullman would serve as vice president. This would effectively promote sympathetic internationalists to the head of this amateur organization. According to Ullman, the SCCA took action. It demanded that Ullman recant his international stance and apologize for any chaos he had started in the sport. He refused. Soon after, Ullman received a letter that informed him that his lifetime SCCA membership had been canceled. In the program for the 1952 Sebring event, Ullman wrote, "This is the first time that such an event is being run in the United States on a fully fledged international basis. The Sebring event and the Indianapolis sweepstakes are the only international competitions for automobiles in this country that are entered on the autosporting calendar of the world." In a book about Sebring, Ullman later added, "To cap off this bomb was a statement that the race was open to drivers having current AAA credentials in good standing, with foreigners required to have an international FIA license valid for 1952, and would be run in accordance with the rules as published in the 1950 International FIA Sporting Code and its Annex C. Not a word about the SCCA, not a word about the dreaded presence of so-called professionals who would run our sporty boys off the road." At the SCCA election, Fred Wacker was voted as the new president, with Colonel George Felton voted vice president. Felton immediately made his perspective clear by slamming the internationalists as disloyal and evil. Then, the SCCA decided to fight back by establishing its own 12-hour race in Florida the week before Ullman's Sebring event. It was a deliberate attempt to unseat Sebring. Drivers couldn't reasonably compete in both events, and SCCA members who decided to enter the Sebring race would be considered traitors. The SCCA's event was organized by a man named Max Hoffman, a mortal enemy of Ullman's, who tried to unseat its competition in every way possible. He chose a venue of similar latitude to Sebring with a track laid out on an airport. Ullman had already been trying to encourage the Jaguar team to come out to its event with driver Sterling Moss, but Hoffman was supported by a group of East Coast Jaguar dealers. The Jaguar dealers all wanted the Jaguar drivers to protest the Sebring event and race at Hoffman's event instead. As a result, Jaguar was frustrated and withdrew entirely. Lofty England, Jaguar's racing manager, said, "We're not going at all if they cannot decide when or where to have the race." The SCCA's take on Sebring was a modest success, but it had a very significant impact on Ullman's event. Sebring saw fewer entries and fewer spectators than Ullman had predicted because many people had simply opted to go to the SCCA's event instead. Ullman, though, had attracted a decent international field of entrants, and they were breathlessly reported on in both France and Italy, giving Sebring those international credentials it needed to survive. The SCCA's rival event had no strong overarching purpose as far as its organizational goals were concerned. Its sole purpose was to thwart Ullman's success, but it served no greater goal. It also soured many British manufacturers' opinions of the SCCA, which relied heavily on British cars for competition. Those two events set the stage for a long-term battle. And then, at the 1952 Watkins Glen Grand Prix, everything suddenly changed. A 7-year-old boy named Frankie Vazzari was killed when the SCCA president Fred Wacker ran just a little too wide and brushed the crowd with the rear end of his car. With that single death, the tides of motorsport in America had turned. After the 7-year-old's death, the SCCA was dealt a near-fatal blow. Racing on public roads was effectively banned all across America. The sanctioning body relied on the Watkins, Glen, Bridgehampton, and Elkhart Lake street tracks as integral elements of its yearly calendar. Suddenly, all of those tracks were nixed from contention. In the immediate aftermath, Alec Allman's connections with the military set him up as a natural successor to motorsport organization in the United States. Private airfields represented an incredible place to develop a track that could still keep spectators well away from the action. Of course, there are still more twists and turns because a man named General Curtis LeMay, head of the Strategic Air Command, met SCCA President Fred Wacker just before the fatal race at Watkins Glen, and the two struck up a rapport. LeMay began to offer use of decommissioned air bases to the SCCA for motorsport events, while locals in those once great racing towns embarked on fundraising efforts to develop safe, permanent, purpose-built road courses. Alec Allman continued to develop his own relationship with the FIA, which resulted in a deeply impressive and truly international second running of his 12-hour Sebring race, while also setting the track up as a prospective home for Formula One in America. He would see his dream come true by the end of the decade. As more and more Americans got behind the wheel, the AAA began to struggle. It was taking on increasing insurance responsibilities and struggled to keep up with the evolution of the racing world. The organization ultimately decided to withdraw from motorsport in 1955 after the deaths of Indy racer Bill Vukovich, F1 star Alberto Ascari, and over 80 spectators in a horrifying accident at the 24 Hours of Le Mans that completely changed the course of motorsport in the world. Just like that, the epic battle between America's sports car sanctioning bodies ended. The AAA handed its responsibilities over to the SCCA, and it took on its insurance claims. The subsequent year, 1956, saw the formation of two new sanctioning bodies, the Automobile Competition Club for the United States and the United States Auto Club. ACUS's purpose was to govern American racing on behalf of the FIA, and to this day it processes international competition licenses for American drivers and holds sway over series like IndyCar, IMSA, NASCAR, the NHRA, and more. Meanwhile, USAC was formed specifically by Tony Hallman, owner of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, to sanction championship, sprint, and midget open-wheel racing on oval tracks. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite that simple. Soon, USAC decided it should delve into sanctioning sports car races too, and began its own battle for control of the SCCA. As the SCCA maintained its strict anti-professional stance, the FIA and ACUS revoked the licenses of all drivers who held SCCA memberships. SCCA members started fleeing the organization, forcing then SCCA President Charles Moran to finally give up the amateur-only position. The SCCA would become a professional racing organization. The act of sanctioning motorsport series is always going to be ripe with conflict, especially here in America. After all, the body that determines the rules of a racing series effectively defines the ethos of what that series stands for. When it came to the tense battle between the AAA and the SCCA, the point of contention was less about what kind of racing was done, as opposed to what racing should be entirely. On one hand, you had an organization that saw the value of tapping into an international motorsport community. On the other, you had a group of people that fiercely defended the rights of amateurs to compete without having to worry about being crushed by someone with far more skill who was using this hobby to make a living. Both of these ideologies have merits, but problems came when small sects of people decided that all motorsport should represent their goals. Someone like Cameron Argetsinger, for example, helped found the iconic Watkins Glen Grand Prix, but when he was developing the idea, he needed to rely on the SCCA to help him get it off the ground, despite the fact that his aspirations had always been international and professional. Is he wrong for trying to turn his prized event into what he perceived to be its ultimate destination? Absolutely not. But I think it's also equally difficult to say that the SCCA is in the wrong here, when what it was doing was following its own rules. Personally, I think the big takeaway here is the fact that sanctioning bodies in American motorsport have been and always will be at odds. We're a big country with a ton of different racing disciplines and even more ideas about what the goals of those disciplines should be. The fierce battle between the SCCA and the AAA can be seen as a precursor to other sanctioning body spats, such as the iconic IndyCar split that first saw the championship auto racing teams, or CART, series fracture off from the USAC-directed open-wheel racing in America, something that we're going to talk about a lot more in the next episode. It also mimics the very similar battle between the Champ Car World Series and the Indy Racing League, and it soon led to USAC's hope of dominating all American motorsport as a monolithic sanctioning entity. While things may seem more relaxed now, I will say that it doesn't take much digging to see that there are still plenty of tensions. At this very moment, there's a growing rift in IndyCar with two extremely different factions determined to assert their ideas of what the sport should be. There's also frustration in the NASCAR community as the series moves beyond its traditional oval track routes to add more street and road courses. American sanctioning bodies are territorial. The people in them will always have different ideas of what should happen, and they will inevitably attempt to attract as much talent to their cause as possible. As a result, it's a theme that's going to come up quite a lot here in Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Thank you so much for tuning into this edition of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. In the next episode, which is coming next week, by the way, we'll talk about the battle that once raged between the Indianapolis 500 and a rival race, the USA 500. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, make sure you're subscribed to the DPTJ Patreon. Tiered patrons get exclusive access to weekly blog posts where I delve into contemporary motorsport news and newsletters rounding up the biggest events in the world. Plus, we're about to launch into our first giveaway, so you want to make sure that you're signed up now. If you want to send an email, I have an address for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Also, don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel. Indy 500 season is here, and Home Field is about to release some exceptional pieces of merch that will help you ring in the month of May. You don't want to miss out, and if it's your first time ordering, you can use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after that iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'll give a shout out to the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can also find my full list of sources in the episode description. My primary source for this episode, once again, was Watkins' Glen, The Street Years, 1948 to 1952, Glory, Drama, and the Birth of American Road Racing by Philippe Defechereaux. If you haven't bought yourself a copy yet, go out and get one right now. It is one of my favorite books. I also drew from several web sources via the International Motor Racing Research Center, Sports Car Magazine, and Open Paddock, all of which are linked below. Thank you again for listening to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. I'll see you next week.